Hey squad, happy Tolkien Reading Day! Every year, Tolkien fans celebrate March 25th, the day the ring was destroyed, as a day to revisit and reread their favorite passages from the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I'm delighted to once again be joining my fellow Tolkien YouTube channels in a playlist of videos in honor of this occasion, especially when we're being hosted by the affable and inimitable Timbo Took. You should absolutely check out the rest of the playlist. I'm really excited for some of the videos in this collaboration. The Tolkien Reading Day theme for 2022, chosen by the Tolkien Society, is love and friendship. It's clear that friendships were very important in Tolkien's life. Orphaned with his brother at the age of 12, Tolkien relied on the relationships he forged with others to give him the opportunities to share love and affection that he might otherwise have found in his birth family. His grief at the tragic loss of many of his school friends in World War I, his devotion to his wife Edith, and his eager participation in clubs and societies like the legendary Inklings are some of the many examples of how deeply Tolkien appreciated his found family. His fiction is also rife with examples of this theme, from brotherhoods and fellowships to tender romances and dedicated marriages. But today, I wanted to highlight the role that friendships play for one of Tolkien's most iconic characters, Aragorn, a man usually noted for being exceptional and even alienated from others. The character of Aragorn evolved gradually as Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. Originally, the guide the hobbits met in Bree was a hobbit with wooden feet called Trotter, but as Tolkien determined Aragorn's role as the heir to the throne of Gondor and Arnor, a descendant of Elendil and of Luthien herself, his story began to shape the narrative of Lord of the Rings. Aragorn is one of Tolkien's best-known and best-loved characters, and for good reason. He is experienced, valiant, and charismatic, a fearsome warrior and a skilled healer, as wise as he is courageous. One of the only beings to make Sauron legitimately nervous, but more importantly, at least in my estimation, he remains approachable, and even relatable, despite his epic traits and awe-inspiring destiny. Frodo, for instance, appreciates both sides of him very early on. I have become very fond of Strider. Well, fond is not the right word. I mean, he is dear to me, though he is strange and grim at times. Essentially, Aragorn embodies the traditional ideals of the epic hero, but with a few important twists. Even though he is increasingly confident and capable of breathtaking deeds, he retains his humility, his decency, and most of all his ability to connect with characters from an astonishingly broad array of backgrounds. And this actually becomes an important element in the story's plot, because Aragorn's ability to make friends is what allows him to consolidate the military victory of the West and what makes him an ideal leader as the Third Age of Middle-earth draws to a close. This orientation toward friendship could be explained as just a quirk, but it connects back very logically to what we know of Aragorn's early life, a history that has several parallels with Tolkien's own. Like Tolkien, Aragorn loses his father very early in life, in Aragorn's case at the age of 2, and he is raised by his mother Gilraen. The two find refuge in Imladris with Elrond, who is sympathetic to the plight of the ruling house of the Dúnedain, and moreover is Aragorn's kinsman. Because Aragorn's identity makes him a target, his true heritage and even his name are hidden from him until he grows up. Raised in Rivendell, primarily among elves, from his earliest days he found himself different from the people around him. Even when he learns his name and the truth of his ancestry and joins his fellow rangers, he is still set apart by his status as chieftain, to say nothing of the effects of his unique education. And it's not like a ranger's life is a particularly convivial one. Although he enters human society, Aragorn remains a solitary figure, mistrusted and even mocked by the very people he risks his life to protect. He is obliged to hide the most important details of his life from most of the people he encounters, for their own good. If simple folk are free from care and fear, simple they will be, and we must be secret to keep them so, he says during the Council of Elrond. As a young adult, Aragorn meets Arwen and apparently falls hopelessly in love with her, a sentiment she is slow to return. After she gently dismisses him at their first meeting, it's another 30 years before he can even approach her again. His regard for Arwen presumably precludes the possibility of Aragorn forming any other serious romantic connections during these years, cutting him off from yet another potential source of emotional support. To make matters worse, both his mother and his foster father express reservations about his crush on Arwen, placing a strain on Aragorn's relationships with those few people who truly know him. Elrond goes so far as to point out that the only way Aragorn can hope to provide a good life for Arwen, or indeed for any wife, is to rise above the height of all your fathers since the days of Elendil. So now Aragorn faces the further complication of knowing he must be unique in history, breaking with the traditions of his forebears if he wants to have a chance with the woman he loves most. As a result of all this, he became somewhat grim to look upon, unless he chanced to smile. His face was sad and stern because of the doom that was laid on him. During this period, Aragorn undertakes great travels to distant lands, exploring the hearts of men both evil and good, serving under both King Thengel of Rohan and Ecthelion, the steward of Gondor and father of Denethor. For some people, leaving one's old life behind and starting over in a totally new context can invite new friendships. But this is not the case for Aragorn. He still must keep much of his identity secret for fear of Sauron's retribution. Plus, his extended lifespan means that whatever friendships he might have made during his travels will be soon ended by his new friends' deaths. A particularly poignant example of this is that of Denethor, who encounters Aragorn while he serves as a captain in Gondor under the name of Thorongil. Denethor shares Aragorn's Númenorian heritage, so their lifespans wouldn't have been quite so dramatically mismatched, and he is said to have been as like to Aragorn as one of nearest kin. Denethor could have been one of Aragorn's few real friends, yet due to Aragorn's need for secrecy and Denethor's jealousy and mistrust, the two remain rivals, and Aragorn departs Gondor rather abruptly to avoid open conflict with Denethor. By the time we meet Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, he seems to have come to terms with the factors that necessitate his isolation from others, and he's not overly bitter about it, but we know that deep down he is weary of his loneliness and hungers for true friendship. When he meets the hobbits in Bree, a letter left by Gandalf confirms that Aragorn is trustworthy, and Frodo, surprised and relieved, asks why Aragorn didn't bring up that he was a friend of Gandalf. Aragorn responds that on the one hand, he didn't know that Gandalf had vouched for him, but moreover, he disliked the prospect of winning Frodo over by appealing to a third party. I knew nothing of this letter. For all I knew, I had to persuade you to trust me without proofs if I was to help you. But I must admit, he added with a queer laugh, that I hoped you would take to me for my own sake. A hunted man sometimes wearies of distrust and longs for friendship, but there I believe my looks are against me. Let me just say that again. Faced with the task of convincing 4 flighty and provincial hobbits to trust a rascally man of unknown provenance, and with the fate of the world hanging in the balance, Aragorn dares to hope that he can actually get them to like him on his own merits, without mentioning the highly pertinent fact that they are both probably working with the same wizard. Now, Tolkien didn't have to include this line. Aragorn already has a perfectly logical reason why he wouldn't know to rely on Gandalf's recommendation. But he does include it because it shows something important about Aragorn, a vulnerability that he doesn't often get to show, a deep desire to simply befriend others and not be rejected by them. Because as we've seen, Aragorn doesn't get many chances to make actual friends, and as a result, he values what friendships he does have very highly. He's also not terribly picky about who he makes friends with. After all, the pool of people he has to choose from is already limited enough. So we see Aragorn becoming genuinely attached to a hugely diverse group of people, including a grouchy wizard, a very eccentric elderly hobbit with poetic ambitions, a handful of elf lords, the quintessential odd couple of Legolas and Gimli, and humans of various backgrounds, nationalities, and personalities. A combination of his general outsider status, his extensive travels, and his frequent need to blend in and avoid drawing attention have all made Aragorn a keen observer of other cultures. As a result, he knows how best to communicate with almost anyone he encounters. In the Houses of Healing, he describes Athelas as Kingsfoil to the rustic Yorith, but persuades the pompous Herbmaster that he really does know what he's talking about by using the Quenya nomenclature. In Rohan, Éomer has been commanded by his king, uncle, and foster father Theoden to detain anyone he finds, but Aragorn can talk him out of this by appealing to Rohirric traditions and values. Immediately upon healing Merry after the Battle of the Pelennor, he jokes with him despite the tragedy, death, and doom all around them, because he knows that's how hobbits work. It is the way of my people to use light words at such times and say less than they mean, Merry says, explaining his apparent flippancy. We fear to say too much. It robs us of the right words when a jest is out of place. This is hardly news to Aragorn, who replies, I know that well, or I would not deal with you in the same way. But more important than his cultural savvy is Aragorn's ability to understand what motivates people and relate to their concerns. He almost immediately picks up on Sam's particular dedication to protecting Frodo and goes out of his way to repeatedly reassure him that he means Frodo no harm, even though he presents a more forbidding aspect to the hobbits generally during their trek to Rivendell. Boromir makes a few disparaging comments when it is proposed that Aragorn might actually be someone in a position to help Gondor out of its current crisis. But although Bilbo takes offense, Aragorn does not. Behind Boromir's proud and defensive words lie desperation at his country's plight and resentment of how easily the elves seem to have dismissed Gondor's efforts to fend off Sauron. So when Aragorn does respond, he makes a point of telling Boromir that he too knows what it means to work hard on behalf of people who don't seem to recognize his efforts. Less thanks have we than you, travelers scowl at us and countrymen give us scornful names. Strider I am to one fat man who lives within a day's march of foes that would freeze his heart, yet we would not have it otherwise. Boromir refuses to outright ask for Aragorn's help or even openly accept his offer, but it's pretty clear that deep down Boromir is secretly hoping that just maybe Aragorn might really be who he says he is and could help save Gondor. So Aragorn, recognizing this, stops offering to help and flat out tells Boromir that he's coming with him. Aragorn also lets Boromir know that he doesn't expect Boromir to trust him immediately and is prepared to earn his respect. When Boromir wonders whether the hand that wields the sword that was broken has inherited not an heirloom only, but the sinews of the kings of men, Aragorn says, "Who can tell? But we will put it to the test one day." Aragorn can't return Éowyn's romantic sentiments, but he does respect and care about her, and understands her frustration at being given what she considers the less worthy task of staying behind to govern in Theoden's stead. She accuses Aragorn of holding a double standard based on her gender, but when Aragorn addresses her, he does not make the mistake of suggesting that she is somehow unfit to accompany him due to some feminine delicacy. Instead, he speaks in terms of their shared duties and explains he doesn't necessarily want to do the task he's been given either. He can't promise her the renown she craves, but he can and does acknowledge her capacity for valor. These are three very different situations, but in each, Aragorn is able to empathize with the fears and desires of another, and build rapport by addressing their unspoken concerns. It's a little uncanny, even knowing that for his whole life Aragorn has been forced to specialize in reading people and finding some way to relate to them no matter their situation. It's also a very distinct, personalized approach to leadership. Aragorn can, and sometimes does, make use of more conventional techniques like rationally defending a proposed course of action, or inspiring others with his personal bravery and charisma. But he evokes the greatest loyalty in those he's able to befriend on a personal level. And he's capable of befriending almost anyone. Legolas sums it up well, saying, "All those who come to know him come to love him after their own fashion." And for Aragorn, this isn't just good politics or a method for manipulating people. He really does care about all his friends. He tells Éomer that of all the fears and worries plaguing him when he took the paths of the dead, he was most often worried for Éowyn's well-being. After bidding goodbye to Éomer, Merry, and Theoden, he tells his kinsman Halbarad, "There go three that I love, and the smallest not least." When Boromir dies in his arms, he cries so hard that Legolas assumes he has taken deadly hurt. This despite the fact that, if anything, the sudden death of the steward's loyal heir on the very borders of the kingdom Aragorn hopes to reclaim is pretty convenient politically. With Gondor and Rohan on the brink of disaster in desperate need of his services, he drops everything to chase after his abducted hobbits for days, not because they are particularly important figures, viewed objectively, really they aren't, but simply because they're his friends, and he's not about to abandon them. And this ethos informs how he approaches governing Gondor and Arnor when he does become king. The main way he chooses to renew and strengthen ties with Rohan is not through strategic intermarriage or cunning trade negotiations, it's by taking a vow of friendship with his bro Éomer. His realm is enriched by trade with Mirkwood and Erebor due to his close friendship with Legolas and Gimli, who seem to have leveraged the foreign policy of their respective realms to give themselves unlimited excuses to drop in on the King of Gondor. While he declares the Shire to be under his protection, he also makes it a free land in its own right and forbids men from entering it. Even the tribes of men who, until recently, served Sauron, the Easterlings and Haradrim, are given pardon and land of their own. Asking about Aragorn's tax policy has become something of a meme, but focusing on the bureaucratic details of Aragorn's governance really does miss the point. Aragorn just doesn't think in terms of political maneuvering or competing for resources. He views other nations as friends, or at least as potential friends, and accordingly he prioritizes respecting others' independence rather than overpowering them, trusts in a sense of mutual responsibility and goodwill rather than enforcing a legalistic system of duties and penalties, and seeks reconciliation rather than retribution. This isn't to say he's naive or unwise, or that he doesn't enshrine these policies in formal declarations or public vows, but the core of his political philosophy is that of friendship. And it turns out that this is exactly what Middle-earth needs in the wake of Sauron's defeat. The destiny Aragorn has to fulfill is not just to defeat Sauron or reclaim a throne, It's to renew his realm and usher in a new era, the Age of Men. Not the Age of Gondor or of the Dunedain, but of men generally. This is a pretty big task, and it requires a leader who won't act out of ambition or paranoia, one who will act in the best interests of other nations as well as their own. One whose unique combination of genetics and innate traits and life experiences have left him confident, wise, and just emotionally damaged enough to desire real friends more than power or security. And providentially, Aragorn happens to be the perfect person for that job. If you enjoyed this video, click that like button like you want to let it know how much it means to you. If you're as keen on friendship as Aragorn is, consider subscribing and see if you vibe with the rest of my content. Remember to check out the rest of the Tolkien Reading Day playlist because you never know where you're going to find your new BFF. And thank you for watching.